So thank you for coming. Today, I'm Lauren Marshall. I'm Associate Professor in the Department of Learning Sciences. And today I'm going to talk about applying for an NSF Career Award. And this talk has a few different steps because some of you may have never applied for an NSF award before. So there are a lot of pieces and a lot of tips about just applying to NSF awards in general that I'd like to share first, including some specific to career. And then if you've never reviewed for NSF before, it's a fabulously enlightening experience. And now that when I was pre-tenure, I had to limit it to I only do one every year because it's a very time-intensive process, but you learn so much from it. So I'm going to share some of those lessons that I've learned from being an NSF reviewer and that I've had talking with other NSF reviewers. And then to end, we're going to talk about some specific career advice specifically for colleagues in the College of Education and Human Development. It'll apply a little bit more generally, but there are some things for us in education in particular. So the structure of an NSF application has, like I mentioned, a lot of different pieces, and it can be really intimidating if you're just reading the PAPG, which is like the policies and procedures. So I wanted to go over them briefly and the various resources that you have to help you complete all these different pieces. So first is the project summary. It's your typical abstract. It's one page. We'll talk about the pieces that you want to include in that, but this and the first couple pages of the project description are where you sort of make or break your proposal. Next is the project description, which is limited to 15 pages. Most of the time when I write an NSF proposal, it starts, even though I know I'm aiming for 15, I'll still hit like 20 and have to cut it back and back and back. So that is a very limited space, so we'll talk about how to make the most of that. We're excited, of course, since we are scholars. The budget and budget justification I'll talk about specific what you might include in a career award in terms of budget, because they're very hedgy about not telling you there's a limit, there's such and such. It sort of depends a little bit based on the directorate that you're applying for, but it's also, if you ask a program officer, they'll say, just tell me what you need to be successful. So we'll talk about what that might look like. And then there's some additional pieces. All of these are very formulaic. So there's personal information about you, which is like a 2-page bio sketch, it's like a shortened CV, your collaborators so that they know who's a conflict of interest for reviewing, and current and pending funding so they know what other externally funded projects you have going on, which can sometimes be used to discuss whether you have the capacity to do this project. And then institutional information, a data management plan. This again is very prescriptive. We'll talk about the pieces for that. A postdoc mentoring plan if you plan to have a postdoc, and then facilities and resources, which is sort of your department, the university, the facilities that you have available to you. And last are letters of commitment. So for the project summary page, the structure should basically be, you should include these 4 things. So why is this project worth taxpayer money? And I feel like a lot of people don't start there, and they really should. Because that's one of the things about being a reviewer, is that's what people talk about, is this project worth $500,000? So starting with why is this project worth taxpayer money, it's not how we're used to starting our research projects, but it's how a proposal should maybe not explicitly say it, but imply why this is a worthwhile project. Second, you want to go to straight, what are you doing? I get 2-3 pages into a lot of proposals before I'm like, oh, I see what you are actually doing. It's very much like, this is the problem, and this is the motivation, and this is, the sort of types of things that we want to do, but I'm like, okay, but what are you doing? So make that very clear at the start. You should also obviously include the problem that you're trying to solve. So a lot of times this is hard to aim in an NSF proposal because you're not talking to people in your subfield. You're talking to people who are generally related to your field. And so the problem that you're trying to solve needs to be a little bit higher level than what you're used to describing in research papers. And then the last is I always include a paragraph that's a summary of the intellectual merit, which is what is the knowledge gained from this project, and a paragraph about the broader impact, which is what is the society impact of this project. So as I mentioned, reviewers will be from an interdisciplinary background, so you sort of have to take things a level higher in terms of justifying things. Don't assume that just because everyone in your field has bought onto a specific line of logic that the reviewers necessarily will, especially when you're going back up to this first question, which is this worth taxpayer money? All right, the project description, which is where you will spend 90% of your efforts. The first 1 or 2 pages, like I mentioned, is where you're going to win people over or lose them. So usually when I'm reviewing, maybe this isn't good to admit out loud, but I will read the project summary in the first couple pages of each proposal. And from there, you can kind of tell whether it's going to be a good proposal or not. And so I'll read those to sort of get a scope of how the rest of the work needs to be laid out. And if I have, only 2 hours on one day, I'm like, well, I can probably get through one of the proposals that's not going to be very good. So this really is where you sort of lose reviewers a lot of times. So the motivation, I try to keep it to about 3/4 of a page. And just justifying why you're doing something. On that very first page, make sure it's very clear what you are doing. So you should provide a summary of work. And in a career proposal, I also like to include why you are uniquely positioned to do this work. So like in my career proposal, I said that I'm a CS education researcher in a college of education, which at the time was very rare. Most people are in departments of education, so they don't have a lot of background around education, a lot of teachers to work with, all those sorts of things. So I said, I am the person to do this sort of work because of the position that I'm in. And then you also want to talk about, in that first 2 pages, the intellectual merit. So what are you doing and what knowledge will be gained from that work? All sort of couched in why is this a problem that people should care about. Pages 3 to 5 are your literature review, and it's going to be extremely painful, but your literature review should be about a page. And it sucks, but that's really all the space that there is for it. This section, the 3 through 5, should also include prior work that you've done. So think of a general literature review is about a page, and then your prior work, especially if you have any sort of pilot studies or prior NSF work that's related, that's a great place to put this. There's no way other to say it. It's just really painful to cut all that out. And I'll describe with the reviewers, because you only have 15 pages. It's not like you can pre-register a study and say, I'm going to do this and be very specific about all the details. You can't provide all the literature that's relevant. You can't provide basically any of the things that reviewers will ask questions about. They'll want to know whether you considered this. They'll want to know whether you considered that. There's just no room for it. It drives me crazy in reviews because people are like, well, they only spent 2 pages talking about what the statistics education literature is like. And I'm like, how much did you want them to spend on it? Like, there's no space if you want to actually talk about the project. So it will be very painful, but know that it's normal. In terms of building trust, though, the things you can do is say, I know I'm not talking about this, but here's, the reviews that I'm familiar with or something like that. So pointing to things that you know are missing and that you're aware of them and considered them, but not having to include all the details of them is sort of a strategy you can use. The prior work is really important because that is a huge trust builder, is if you're already doing something along the lines of what you're proposing, then they know that you have the skills and ability to do it. And then page 6 through 12. So if I get to page 6 and we're not talking about the proposal, the actual research project, I'm usually starting to get like really, not bored is not the word, but it's sort of like, okay, what's the actual project? So that's about, as a reviewer, the place that I'm starting to look for the project details. And you want to describe the project in as much detail as you can fit. And I know this seems contrary to what I said earlier, which is that these people aren't going to be in your subfield, so you have to take things a little step higher in terms of justifying them and describing the motivation. However, those like little details, so if you can say, instead of doing a statistical analysis, you can say we're going to do an ANCOVA because we have this as a pre-test and this as a post-test. It doesn't actually take that much more space to provide those specific details, but it builds a lot of trust that you've thought through this project, that you know exactly what are going to do and have the skills to carry it out. This should include your expected results, limitations as another good trust building area to know what you won't know, and a plan B. So you should spend at least a paragraph on, I expect that this point in the project is going to be a decision tree, and we're either going to go down this one that I think is going to work, or if that's really not working, we can go down this plan B. And it just shows that you're aware of what the trade-offs are, what the different possibilities are. Like I always tell my grad students, if you have a research question that you know the answer so well that there's no plan B, then that's not a very good, it's not a very interesting research question if you already know what the answer is. There is a specific section in the career proposal that is called Research and Teaching Integration. So if it's a 5-year proposal, so if fitting 5 years of research into a 15-page proposal wasn't hard enough, instead of the normal 3 years, you also have to add this extra section, which should be about a page, talking about how you're going to basically develop as a well-rounded scholar. So the purpose of career is to accelerate your career trajectory. If that's not exactly what it says in the program solicitation, that's close to what it says in the program solicitation. So that's why they're interested in both your research and teaching sides as a scholar. I'll talk about this a little bit more at the end when we're talking about College of Education specific career advice, because honestly this one's sort of easy for us because everything we do is already sort of teaching and research centered. So page 13 through 14 reserved for project evaluation and dissemination. I think a lot of people miss the project evaluation part of the proposal. For a career proposal, I highly recommend an advisory board. Basically, there's two options in project evaluation. There's an advisory board, which is made up of a few different people with expertise in the area, or there's an external evaluator. So if you're doing like a large scale up, or especially a really large quantitative project, then an external evaluator might be appropriate. But I like career just because it's more early stages typically. It allows you to have feedback from experts in a bunch of different areas, and it gives you access to senior scholars in your field and gives you a good working relationship with them. Also, the project dissemination. So I had a chart in my proposal that was, I'm going to write a paper about this topic for this audience, and it's going to go to this journal or a journal like it. This paper is for this sort of audience, and it's going to go to an appropriate journal for that audience. So thinking through those dissemination plans can be really helpful. And then the last page is basically, I like to always sum up with the broader impact of what is the impact on society that this project will have. And that lends itself well to other sorts of concluding remarks, future work, that sort of thing. So that's the project description. For the budget and budget justification, our pre-grant teams are amazing. At least that's always been my experience. Most of the time they want you to just say, I want this, 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 this in the budget, and they will make a budget for you based on a template that they have. So I highly recommend going for that. Your salary, for a career, it should be a substantial amount of your salary. At least 1 month of effort. Mine's 1.5. The maximum you can ask for is 2, because NSF has a rule that you can't have more than 2 months of your salary paid for by all of your NSF grants. You can get exceptions to that rule, but it's probably not smart to ask for that within a single grant. GRAs are postdocs. I have one GRA in my award, and that's based on the sort of average budget that they recommend. That seems about right. Domestic and international travel. This could be for things like conferences. Another thing that I did in my award was I put in extra domestic travel in the first couple of years so that I could visit other colleges of education who had computer science education programs. Because at the time I was the only person here doing that sort of work. It's not like I could learn from my colleagues here, because there weren't any. So I could learn from my colleagues at other schools. This also lets me go, hey, you want me to come give a talk at your school? I'll pay for my travel and everything, and no one's going to say no to that. So it's a great way to sort of increase your exposure and share your work. Participant support and human subject remuneration. This would include any advisory board members that you have. So my advisory board, I said that they were going to serve more than the usual advisory board, that they were also going to be my mentors. So I budgeted appropriately for that. For a normal advisory board, I'd say it's about $500 as a stipend to $1,000, depending on how much you're asking. For my advisors, I paid them $1,500 a year so that we had more time to work with. Materials and supplies, if that applies to your research, I always put at least $1,000 a year in there, just in case, like, you need something. And then publication costs. I don't know how many people are aware of this, but NSF requires that any publications from an NSF report are open access. This can be satisfied with like the author approved manuscript version, et cetera, but it's easier to just put open access publication fees as part of the grant. And then conference registration is another line. Again, if you just tell your pre-grant person which of these things or what amounts you want for each of them, they'll create a budget for you. And so, yeah, I think I described about what I had for each of these. So mine came to about $500,000 over 5 years, which I think is pretty typical for College of Education. Although I think Natalie's is 800 or something, because she had a lot of participant support and that sort of thing. All right, personal and institutional info. Science CV, I would recommend, even if it wasn't going to be required in the near future. So I think in October, it's going to be required that you use Science CV for your BioSketch and current and pending. But it's just a website that you go to and you enter your information and it spits out the appropriately formatted version, which is way better than trying to format it yourself. Then collaborators. I don't know if this is standard across all colleges, but in our college, there's sort of a spreadsheet that you fill out with, who your graduate advisor was, different journals that you published in the last year, different collaborators in the past few years. The data management plan, there's a list of like 7 things in the PAPG of data management considerations. The best data management plans, go through those 7 and just formulaically say, this is what we're going to do for this thing. The ones, when you're reviewing, it's basically like, is the data management plan sufficient? And the ones that don't follow that formulaic view, you have to go and like look through and try to figure out if it's sufficient. And I'm like, it's just a ton of work for the reviewers. Facilities, there's probably a version of this for your department. ask around for it so that you're not starting from scratch, because it's not going to be specific to you. It's specific to the department and college. And then if you do include a postdoc, you have to have a postdoc mentoring plan, which should include some sort of individual development plan. That's the main thing that reviewers seem to look for. All right, letters of commitment. These are really easy because you basically want to ask for a letter from anyone or organization that's named in the project description. You don't have to have them, but when they're missing, sometimes the reviewers will question whether the people that you've said you need to help with the project will actually help with the project. So it's better to have them. It's really easy though, because it has to be this exact sentence. People got smart that letter writers were including additional information about the project in the letters, and they want you to be limited to 15 pages, so instead they just said you have to fill this out. And this is in the PAPG. The other unique requirement for a career proposal is you have to have a departmental letter from your department chair that says that they will, well, you're eligible and that they will support you. So make sure you know what those specific requirements are, or that your chair knows what those specific requirements are. One of those things that colleges that have a lot of career proposals seem to do, that the colleges who don't have a lot of career proposals don't do, is they'll add extra incentives in these departmental letters. So they'll say, and if this person's awarded this thing, then they'll get an extra buyout for the first 2 years while they're, really working on the career side or the research side or something. So you might be able to leverage some things from your department chairs in that context. So these they do have like a very specific requirements for them, but they don't have it's not, a formula like this. So I would at least write like bullet points for your department chair to write it, because it's going to be way easier for you to describe the project than it will be for them. All right, some lessons learned from being an NSF reviewer. Even sharing these lessons, I highly recommend that you review for NSF. It should not be hard to get onto a panel. Just talk to whatever program officer is working on the programs that you're interested in, and they'll probably have something for you. It's really illuminating in a way that's hard to express. But one of the first things you learn as a reviewer is that, at least when I started writing NSF proposals, I knew how to write research papers, so that's what I was emulating in NSF proposals. And that is not a winning strategy. So in a research paper, one, your reader chooses to read it, which is key. Second, the reader is in your subfield. They want to learn something. It's also key. So a research paper should be written like a research paper. However, a research proposal, the reader does not want to be reading it, but they have agreed to read it. They're from a related field, and we'll be talking about it with people from different fields than them. And they want to be fair while reducing their workload as much as possible. So they want to find a reason to dismiss it as early as possible if they can. It's not very nice, but when you have 10 proposals that you're reading on top of your normal workload, that's how it goes. So instead, think of writing a research proposal like a magazine. It should be interesting to look at, in addition to hopefully the content being interesting. So some key features of the NSF proposals are that they are 15-page limits. Like I said before, there's no way that you can include everything. So the goal is to build trust. You can't if you're familiar with like IES proposals or something, which are 25 pages and they're read by an internal review board who has expertise in reviewing, you're basically pre-registering a study when you're doing an IES proposal, but that's not what you're doing for an NSF proposal. There's just not enough space. So you want to be as specific in the details as possible. I recommend being one level more specific than you think is justified, just because it will make it seem more concrete and more like you have thought this through and know exactly what you're going to do. No one is going to go through your proposal 5 years later and say, oh, you said you were going to do an ANCOVA here, but you did a MANOVA. No one's going to do that. But saying that you know what the difference is important. So this isn't to get away from discussing trade-offs and things that are important for making decisions in your work, but you can't discuss all the trade-offs. So this is a way of going through those trade-offs yourself and coming up with something that's really specific and really concrete. Because the thing that I see kills the most NSF proposals, whether it's career or not, is people are like, I just have no idea what this is going to look like. So I don't know if they can do it. Of course, it drives me a little bit crazy because I'm like, well, it's going to take 3 years to figure out exactly what it looks like. But that is the feedback that I hear most often, so I wanted to share that with y'all. Also, always make sure to fill the 15 pages. So I told you when I was going through and like I do a pre-review of the project summary in the first couple pages, then I'll skip to the end and see if it's actually at 15 pages. Because I've seen a few that are like 14 and a half, 14 and 3/4. I'm like, if you're not cramming to fill every possible detail in this paper, I can already tell what the quality of the proposal is going to be. And that's something that I figured out through reviewing. It's not an a priori sort of hypothesis that I came in with. It's just all the papers that aren't just cram-packed full are not as high a quality as the ones that are. Like I mentioned, this is an external review, so if you're not familiar with the NSF process, the program officers will get the papers, and then they have external reviews of, these days with the virtual reviews, it's like 5 to 6 people, and those 5 to 6 people each review 7 or 8 proposals. Not all of them read all proposals, so it's maybe 15 proposals in total that they're evaluating. But at least 3 people will write an external review, and then they'll, at the meeting, discuss them as a panel. So, and that's where it's determined whether they're not competitive, competitive, or highly competitive. So if an NSF program officer gets a proposal, even if they like it and it's marked as not competitive, there's nothing that they can do going forward with that. So that's why external review is important, because reviewing, it lies solely on these people who are not full-time reviewers, they have other jobs, and you're sort of at their mercy a little bit. All right, so how do you make reviewers happy? How do you write a proposal like a magazine article? First thing is to include something visually salient on every single page. Whether this is like a bolded line, or a bolded list, or a table, or some sort of figure, it helps the reviewer when because they're probably not going to read top to bottom. So it helps the reviewer identify what's the purpose of this page. And it also helps them remember when they're in the panel discussing things, where to find information, which is really important. So that's related to the second point, make information easy to find. Because so often, as we all do, reviewers will miss things when they're reading at first. And so they'll raise a concern in the panel, and someone else will say, oh no, they talked about that. But it's, of course, if the reviewer missed it, it's like one line somewhere buried on page 8. And then you just have to sit there and try to find this one line. So if you make that information easy, it makes it easier to rebut those sorts of complaints. Include examples. This is related to people not being in your subfield. So if you can use examples that make things obvious, or understandable to people outside your subfield, that's much more helpful than using abstract language. Include interdisciplinary expertise. So in my opinion, the best NSF proposals include some sort of interdisciplinary expertise. In career, however, it's a single PI proposal. So, you can have interdisciplinary expertise, but you're only one person. So one thing I recommend is including advisors that represent different disciplinary expertise that you think is valuable to the project. The last time I was reviewing for NSF career, this was a common thing, was that we thought people were trying to use a skill set that they did not demonstrate that they had. And when they had an advisor who did have that skill set and whose explicit job was to help them develop that skill set, it was way more compelling than this person seems to want to use a new methodology that they've never used before, and this doesn't seem like an appropriate place to try that out. So in education, don't shortchange teachers. Talking about participant support drives reviewers crazy when you're like, I'm going to get, $7,000 a year from this and travel and a grad student. And then I'm going to pay teachers $50 for 10 hours of participation. It's not going to fly. So here's pages from my career proposal. It's not important that you can read them, obviously, but this is what I mean when I say write it like a magazine article. So there's a big chunk of space, an image, my sort of the crux of what we wanted to teach people is in this sort of box. And then a timeline. I would highly recommend including a timeline because it helps you determine what is the appropriate scope of work, and it shows the reviewers that you know what an appropriate scope of work is. So every year, some people even split it up into fall, spring, and summer semesters. What are you going to be doing, and how does that contribute to the full project? Speaking of having an appropriate scope of work, a lot of people try to oversell their contribution. Don't do this. It's one of those things that breaks trust with the reviewers, is when you don't know that you're signing on for like half of your work over the next 5 years to be devoted to this project. Especially when you're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, and broader impacts, don't oversell your contribution. People are very sensitive to those sorts of issues. Don't miscite references. There were a couple of proposals I reviewed recently that I was like, this statement doesn't seem right to me. I'm going to go look up the reference that they used, and it was not related, which made me completely lose all trust in the rest of the proposal. Include a timeline like we already talked about, and then a logic model. So a logic model is probably not something that you use in anything else, but it talks about what the inputs of the project are, the activities that you will do, the outcomes that those activities will have, and the impact that will have. So it's usually included in the project evaluation section as an evaluation tool, like for an evaluator. But it also serves as a nice summary of what the project is about, what you will be doing, and what the outcomes will be. You should highlight connections to solicitation goals or NSF rules. So I recently submitted a proposal that we included some colleagues who were not in the US. And according to NSF rules, you can't pay people who are not in the US as principal investigators because it's the American National Science Foundation. And we kind of explained that, expecting people to know that that was a rule, but they didn't know that that was a rule, and they were like, it's completely unreasonable that these people not from the US would not be principal investigators. I'm like, but they literally can't be. So explain any of that. It's hit or miss whether the program officer will jump in and offer that information, so just include it in your proposal. And then one thing that I learned recently that I'm excited to use in my next proposal is if you cite NSF's own mission, this can make the job of the program officers easier. So when your program officer comes back from a panel and they have, a slew of highly competitive and competitive proposals, and they're trying to figure out what they want to put in their portfolio, then knowing how the proposal aligns with the mission helps them to do that, or it helps them to sort of trade your proposal to someone else and say, I already have this specific thing in my portfolio, but you might be interested in this high quality program. All right, and then to end with some specific career advice, especially for the College of Education, don't be shy. This is the reason that I wanted to give this proposal, was because in the career panel, the program officer said, we want to fund more career awards in the education directorate. And we're just not getting enough high quality proposals. So I know y'all have high quality ideas, so the point is to help to translate into that to high quality proposals so that we can help the government spend their money. All right, and then this program is for early career faculty. So for some reason, people seem more intimidated to submit to career than a typical NSF proposal. It's like, well, if you're submitting to a typical NSF proposal, you're up against people who have been doing this for 30 years. In career, you're only up against people who have been doing it for exactly as long as you have. So it is specifically for career faculty. And one of the things that shows that it's for career faculty and that NSF is trying to support early career people is that all proposals get a full panel review. So in NSF proposals, what can happen is if all of the individual reviews for a proposal are low rating, then that proposal will get triaged and it won't be discussed in panel. That's not true in career. Every proposal gets a full discussion from the panel so that the PI gets the best advice and support going forward. Also, this takes a long time. This is why we're talking about it in February when it's not due until July. So the submission, like showed with the structure of NSF proposals, has a lot of different components. Pre-grant teams have checklists because they realize that it has a lot of different components. Get started on them now, especially because career is about your career trajectory, which means that you have to have a vision for what you want to do with the rest of your career, 5 years and beyond. So that can morph and take shape as you're working on your proposal. Even if you're not going to submit to career this year, I recommend that you write a career proposal because it gives you the space and sort of a structure to think through what the next 5 years of your work is going to look like. And in my opinion, we don't spend enough time doing that. We just keep chasing projects until sometime we get to the end of our project. So think about what you want to accomplish in 5 years. It takes time. And then what tools or resources can help. So if there's a summer workshop that you've always wanted to go to, great. Use career funding to go to that. If there's some people that you really want to work with or a particular knowledge that you want to gain, use your advisory board and members to work on that. Like I mentioned, I included a lot of travel in mine so that I could visit other people and sort of become better known in the field and I get a better idea of what's happening in the field. And then a common way that people disseminate information from NSF proposals is that they'll make a project website to share their products and materials and all sorts of things. If you don't know how to make a website, great. Now is a great time to learn. So you can say that you're going to do that as part of this dissemination plan, and that part of that work is going to be figuring out how to do that. I wanted to circle back to this research and teaching integration section because it is unique to career. And specifically in the College of Education, this integration is baked into what we do because our research is for the goal of education. So this should really be a strength of a proposal in education. Because you would be applying to the education directorate, you would be considered on a panel with only other education people. And it's very clear who has been thoughtful about their research and teaching integration and who has not. So spend a little bit of time on this. It should be a strength. I think of it sort of like the broader impact, that it's a way to go beyond just you sitting in your office alone thinking about research, and a way to have an actual impact on the community. Don't forget that training grad students is education. And also consider any sort of community or nonprofit organization outreach. So like the Atlanta Science Festival, if you want to go and share there, that's a great way to increase your teaching integration. There's also, one of the proposals I saw was working with a nonprofit, and so it was a very, symbiotic relationship. So in my proposal, I included this image, which was how the research activities for computing education paired up with my CS education teaching activities, and how those two things informed each other. There's additional resources. I'll let Chris talk about any of the college-specific ones, and then on URSA, so the University Research something, they have some NSF resources there for the whole university, including some templates and some other tools you might be interested in. And they also told me that if you want any assistance, like if you're thinking about it and you want some help, you don't need anything more specific than that to reach out to this email address. And they'd love to know that you are considering applying. All right.